Well, good morning, or good afternoon, or good evening, or whenever you're encountering this recording of All Church Sunday School. Welcome to All Church Sunday School. I trapped myself with my order of words there. Sorry about that. I am Jamie Plunkett here alongside Renee Hoke again.
Hello there. I'll just say howdy, which you can say at any time of the day.
It's true.
Howdy.
That's a very flexible greeting. Welcome to our continuation of a conversation about Paul and Jesus, a book written by James Tabor. Paul and Jesus, How the Apostle Transformed Christianity. Last week was our first week trying to tackle Tabor's work, and it is...
And deciding we had taken... You remember when we were doing... Well, one of the things we discovered last summer as we were doing digital worship is we had bread in our hands, and sometimes we would break off too big a piece,
yes,
put it in our mouth, and then we couldn't speak.
And then you're stuck there chewing in front of the camera for far too long.
So this book feels like a great, big, delicious piece of fresh bread.
Yes.
That you can hardly swallow.
Small bites, little bites. We got to take little bites. And so we are taking little bites of chapter 2 today, talking about resurrection, talking about how Paul's interpretation of Jesus' resurrection, how Paul's working with two different ideas of resurrection that were very common at the time, has kind of led to this blended notion of resurrection for us as Christians. It's going to be a really fun conversation today.
I love this conversation. People are curious about what does the Bible say about resurrection.
Yes.
I think if you've ever asked questions about that, this is a really good chapter.
It is a fantastic chapter. Tabor asks some of the big questions around resurrection, but we're actually going to start our conversation around bones. Bones. We got an email from Sandra Soria after last week's conversation, and the email reads as follows. Renee and Jamie, the discovery of Paul's remains are definitely an interesting phenomenon. If we were able to use carbon dating or some other scientific means to definitively prove that Jesus did not live, could not have ever been in Nazareth or those places, would we close up shop and no longer follow the way? I knew someone in college who would say it never really happened, but if it did, it would have happened just that way. I know you've both thought through that, so wondering where you landed. Scientific research is a tenuous path for me, but because faith for me means the proof is unnecessary. Great
comment. Thank you, Sandra, for writing to us.
Absolutely.
Good questions. And if you weren't watching last week, then the beginning of the book, James Tabor spends 45 years of his career tracking down a historical Paul. Mm-hmm. So the beginning of the book is him going to the Basilica of St. Paul outside the walls in Rome. And actually, we talked a little bit about the recent discovery of carbon dating that seems to validate that is, in fact, that could very possibly, those could be Paul's remains.
Bones.
So
they are
that's
dated
why
to
we were on the subject.
Around the same time as Paul lived.
End of first century fabric. They also carbon 14 examination.
We know that Paul died in Rome. We can assume that Paul died in Rome. So you responded to Sandra's email with some of your own thoughts. When Sandra emailed you and thinking through this idea of if Jesus didn't live, would we still be followers of the way? What were your thoughts on that question?
Well, I just wanted to, for folks who don't have a copy of the book, James Tabor makes it very clear that he's a historian in search of historical facts about Paul and his influence. And so as I was reading the story of him going to the sarcophagus and feeling kind of overwhelmed with that, it was real clear to me that he was working, that was one track.
Yeah.
And the influence of Paul in my own life, which was significant coming from a more conservative church, was another track, and it didn't really rely on any carbon dating. But it reminded me of a trip to the Holy Land where I was with a group of pastors from various denominations. And we would go to all of the places that you go to, all of the cathedrals that mark these events in Jesus' life. And we were aware that some of these sites had been designated by Constantine's mom in the 3rd century. And, and there were postcards you could buy. And it felt we were a little concerned about how is this going to feel to us. But the thing that I wanted you and Sandra to know about from this memory of mine is the pilgrims coming from all around the world who would kneel down, who would weep at these sites. And the holiness of a place is not so much the way I was raised. However, we do think places are holy.
I think so.
We all think there are these thin places. Mm-hmm. And what I began to think over a couple of days of watching some people be so emotive at these sites, and our group just standing there like we were reporters from the Daily News or something, I just thought, what's the deal with us? I mean, the birth of Jesus, the place where Jesus was buried. I mean, all of those events are important to me. Yeah. I'm a follower of Jesus. I'm not weeping. Sometimes there would be groups singing in all kinds of different languages from around the world, singing a hymn because they're there at the loaves and fishes place. Mm-hmm. And we just looked like we weren't even buying any of it. So I told you the story that one day we said, well, we're believers. We're going to sing the doxology quietly. Yeah. Just, what would happen is groups would just kind of get in a circle and say a prayer and sing a hymn, and then they would leave. And it's very moving. So when on the day that we decided we were going to go to this site and we were just going to quietly sing the doxology together, one of the ministers in our group refused to go in.
Interesting.
Because we were going to sing the doxology. So I have all of this concern about historic places, but concern about marking the events of Jesus' life, marking the events of Paul's ministry. Mm-hmm. What's your thought about that? Have you been to the Holy Land? I've
not been to the Holy Land. I would love to go. I was invited right before the pandemic to go with a group of young clergy, and obviously that trip completely fell through, and so I never even brought it up to anybody here because probably 2 weeks after it was mentioned, it was already not going to happen.
But through the historical path, the path of faith, kind of sometimes the two overlap a little bit.
I think they do, maybe. And I think that's good. I think that's good that they do. I was on the morning program with Shannon Moore a couple of weeks ago, and we were talking about the need to believe in the actual resurrection of Jesus. And I remember very vividly growing up at my home church, the senior minister stood up in the pulpit one day and said, if the bones of Jesus were discovered tomorrow, I would be the first person to walk across the street and sign up to be a member at the synagogue that's across the street, because there was a huge synagogue across the highway from our church growing up in Dallas. And he said, for me, the physical resurrection and the ascension of Jesus is essential to my faith. And I've always kind of, that thought has always stuck with me, and I've always kind of wavered. Would it matter to my faith if we ever discovered the bones of Jesus and could confirm 100%, yeah, these were the bones of Jesus. So whatever we're saying about resurrection or whatever we're saying about ascension, we've got some big questions now. Granted, that's leaning into one notion of resurrection, which we'll get into today about alternative thoughts on resurrection. But I do think I think history and faith are supposed to overlap. But I also think that in that gray space where things become unclear, that's where you have a choice as a believer, is to say, am I going to lean into what I know about the history of these things, or am I going to lean into my faithfulness and God's faithfulness to me about, all of that's good and well. And we have a calling in this current time. We have a partnership that God is asking us to join into to do some very serious work right now. And so kind of feeling out when I'm in one space and when I'm in the other, if that makes sense.
That makes sense. It absolutely does. On that same trip, we visited the place where all of the tourist buses go for baptisms, the Jordan River. It's been changed because of irrigation in Galilee. And then we went to the edge, kind of a demilitarized zone area, where more likely it was that John might have baptized Jesus, and it was just a small puddle. And it was just all weeds. I mean, the other place was lush.
Big flowing.
And people rented white robes and waded out in the water, and it was cool, and the trees met overhead. But in the moment of being there, remembering our baptisms, we were in the story of Jesus and John the Baptist, and it didn't really matter that we weren't at the most historic place where somebody might have shot at us. You know, it was okay.
Right.
It was okay. The story is real in my heart, in my imagination.
Yeah.
And we were in the neighborhood where it would have happened. So maybe I'm not nearly as insistent on strictly historical, but then I think I'm inconsistent with that. So
for me, the writings are some of the most important things. And we've recovered a lot of those. And,
yes. And our translations are better because of the Dead Sea Scrolls recovery. So yes. So the words,
the words,
not the
matter.
Postcards, but the words.
Not Constantine's mom's house's postcards, but the words of Scripture and the words of those around Scripture at the time.
But there was a witness that was happening to me. Yes, I was at a place that was designated as holy. And yes, we were remembering an event from Jesus' life. But those more demonstrative pilgrims, they were witnessing to me too.
Absolutely.
They were having an impact on me over those days. So
excellent. Well, let's take a look at some art. Today is all about resurrection. We're a couple weeks after Easter. So it seems like it fits. It's appropriate. We're all about resurrection. Once again, thank you to Orlu Logger for all of your hard work looking up a lot of these images. I have picked a few out of the slew that Orlu, that whole sentence, a few out of the slew that Orlu pulled for us. If you'd like to see
it's a
all
lovely
of them,
sonnet.
It is. If you'd like to see all of them, you can probably find those in our show notes on the website if we have that page up and running yet. If we don't, I'll work on that this week.
We'll be working on it.
I'll get with the people that do that to make sure that you can see all of the images that Orlu researches and finds for us, because I think that work needs to be lifted up.
Yes.
The first one that we are looking at, though, is an icon of the resurrection, but it is not necessarily Jesus's resurrection that this icon is depicting. Renee, when you see this image, what are some of the things that stand out to you?
Well, I love the idea that at the end of time, when the trumpet sounds, we're going to talk about where that imagery comes from, that Jesus would walk around and help everybody out.
Yeah.
Now, of course, those look like people coming out with the bodies they had when they went in.
Yes.
Right?
Potentially. I mean,
but
they are
people
coming
that
out
you would
of
recognize. One of the questions I get all the time is, when we get to heaven, will we actually have bodies so we can find that person we wanted to have a chat with? So these people, I like the drama of this. I like the way that I just think this is very hopeful. So the saints are watching. The saints are looking on. There's some other people over to the side, but basically, Jesus is kind of giving you, grabbing your hand and saying, I'm here.
Yes, absolutely. Sorry, I'm looking up one thing because
I thought that you were texting.
I'm not texting
Skylar about dinner or something.
No, I'm not. I cannot remember the name of this Robin Williams film. Anyways, we'll get to why I thought of that in a few moments here. But let's look at our next piece of art, which is actually housed as a part of the Kimball Art Museum's permanent collection here in Fort Worth.
That's awesome.
If you want to see this for yourself, you can head on down to the Kimball and check out the Raising of Lazarus, which is from around 1310. It's tempera and gold on panel. And this is a depiction of Jesus kind of pulling up Lazarus from the dead. Lazarus being kind of just resuscitated, reanimated after recently passing away.
And the chapter that we're talking about cites all the places in the Bible where someone who had stopped breathing was revived, versus the other ways to think about physical resurrection. But this one looks like, I just think that the fact that Lazarus face is, he's wrapped up all except his face is kind of interesting, isn't it?
Well, you think about the story, too, about how Jesus is on his way to Lazarus, gets waylaid a little bit, and then continues on, and Lazarus has died in the midst of Jesus' being waylaid. They really wrapped him up quickly and got him in there quickly. So maybe they just didn't have time to wrap up his face before Jesus finally showed up.
And go ahead.
Oh, sorry. And then our final piece of art is another really interesting depiction, similar to our first, in theme more than in what it looks like. This is Christ leads the dead from Hades or Sheol, from around the same time period, 1311. It's by Duccio, who we've looked at some of his work before.
Yes, that's right. I recognize that artist.
And is in a museum in Florence, Italy, currently is where it resides.
And it looks like Jesus is standing on the devil.
It does look like Jesus is standing on some sort of demonic figure there as he's pulling people out of what looks like a kind of stony tomb area. He's kicked aside the door there. You can see the door is kind of ajar on the ground, and here come all of the dead out of Sheol. So as we get into this, though, what is all of this? What does resurrection and all of this stuff have to do with Paul? Well, James Tabor likes to, as we know, has spent 45 years of his life dedicated to better understanding Paul. He wants to kind of give us a good picture of what Paul is up to. And so in this chapter, Tabor really wants to frame Paul as our best resource for understanding the resurrection and understanding how in the early church they were really working to come to terms with how to not only understand Jesus's resurrection, but how to understand this message of resurrection for all of us in that second kind of coming of Jesus.
Almost the physicality of it.
The physical nature of it, the spiritual nature of it.
Actually work.
What's all going on there? What are the kind of mechanics of resurrection?
Have you had lots of questions about that? I have to say that I don't know that I've needed to understand the nuts and bolts of that.
I don't know that I've necessarily had to explain the nuts and bolts of it, but I do. I mean, I think it's a kind of a common question for youth to ask is kind of what's up with the resurrection. What is going on with that? What does that mean for Jesus to have done that? What does that mean for all of the promises we see of us one day being resurrected? What does that look like? And those questions kind of always revolve.
Adults have those same questions.
Adults have those same questions too. But they always kind of revolve around, like, are we physically coming back? Mm-hmm. Where are we going?
Can I have a better body?
Can I have, this one, I've eaten a lot of candy and cake lately. Maybe I could be more in shape. Those kinds of questions.
Do we get to shop at the resurrection store?
Right.
For our preferred image.
Yes. Pick out the best postcard of you. But will you read for us? So we have some thoughts on Tabor thinking about the gospel accounts of the resurrection versus what Paul writes about the resurrection. And this is kind of how he tees up the entire chapter. If you read those.
And this is really just to demonstrate not that Paul made stuff up, but Paul's influence.
Yes, absolutely.
Paul's role in helping us get our minds and our hearts around that.
Absolutely.
So I'm going to start with all four gospels. Mm-hmm. All four gospels report that Jesus' dead body was hastily laid in a rock-hewn cave tomb and blocked with a stone late in the afternoon on the day he was crucified, but that the tomb was found empty by his followers on the following Sunday morning. New Testament scholars, historians, and even novelists seem incapable of offering a rational explanation as to what most likely happened that first Easter weekend. This seems to be the mystery of the ages when it comes to understanding Christian origins.
If you'd read the next one as well.
Keep going.
Yes.
What I had failed to consider in all those years of analyzing our New Testament gospel accounts was that the answer to this insoluble problem was found in the letters of Paul. I am convinced that there is a rational historical explanation for the resurrection of Jesus and the appearances to the disciples that can stand up to proper historical scrutiny. But if one reads the Gospels alone without using Paul as a key, everything remains a mystery. If we begin with Paul, suddenly everything becomes clear, and we can sort through the Gospels in a way that makes real historical sense.
One more slide.
It is easy to assume that the 4 New Testament Gospels provided us with our earliest reports that Jesus' tomb was found empty and that he was raised from the dead, whereas, in fact, they are our latest witness, ranging in date from AD 80 to 120 or even later. Paul writes in the early 50s AD, just 20 years after Jesus' crucifixion.
So again, what Tabor is really trying to illustrate here is that when we start to use the fullness of the New Testament texts that we have, we can really start to glean a better understanding of this concept of resurrection. But I do love that he notes that that first Easter weekend, just all of the curious questions that folks have around that first Easter weekend are so essential to kind of the Christian origin story itself. And so I'm very excited about this chapter because resurrection has always been something that I've been intrigued by and kind of waffled on, just personally, theologically. And so I'm very excited to dive into this today. But was there anything that stood out to you in those first kind of writings of Tabor that we just read?
I like the idea of claiming the part that comes from Paul because do you want me to tell you about, or I told you about 1 Thessalonians 4:16.
I mean, we can go there now.
Because as I was reading the chapter, I was thinking, I have in my mind the scene, and the trumpet is in it.
Yeah.
And the dead in Christ shall rise. I think those words made it into a hymn. And I was pretty sure that was in Matthew. And I looked. Maybe it was in Luke. I knew it wasn't in Mark. Maybe it was in Luke. I finally found it in 1 Thessalonians 4:16. And it's this image. It's how I understand things will happen. And now, because of the chapter, I understand the Jewish, not Greek, origins of that passage of Scripture. So do you want me to read it or not?
Yeah, go ahead and read it.
Okay. I'm going to back up a couple of 4:16 is the image, but I'm going to start at 13. 1 Thessalonians 4:13. We do not want you to be uninformed, brothers and sisters, about those who have died, so that you may not grieve as others who have no hope. For since we believe that Jesus died and rose again, even so, through Jesus, God will bring with him those who have died. For this we declare to you by the word of the Lord, that we who are alive, who are left until the coming of the Lord, will by no means precede those who have died. For the Lord himself, with a cry of command, with the archangel's call, and with the sound of God's trumpet, will descend from heaven, and the dead in Christ will rise first. So that scene is in my imagination.
Yeah.
I thought it was from the Gospels. It's very clear, and I understand, even more after this chapter and our searching. That's where that comes from.
We do that a lot, I think, where we attribute Pauline work to the Gospels. That vivid imagery, I would have thought it was in Matthew or Luke as well. We do that with the words of institution too, and a couple other things that Paul has really kind of provided for the faith that we just maybe instinctively say, that's part of the kind of the gospel narratives. But what Paul does here, and what we're going to kind of start to suss out, is Paul is giving a very kind of specific understanding of resurrection. And at the time that Paul is writing, there are kind of two competing ideas of resurrection that were really kind of jockeying for prominence in the early Christian faith. And that's because the two largest groups of people who were joining the early church come from either a Jewish background or a kind of Roman Greek background. And those two cultural groups had different ideas of resurrection, and these kind of highlighting those two views on death. With the Greek culture, there was this dualistic understanding of the body really kind of being a house or a home for a soul that was eternal, and so immortal. So our body is this kind of house for an immortal soul, and our body will eventually wither and die, and our soul will then move on. And so in this Greek understanding, once the body dies, the soul is released. That soul travels down to the underworld of Hades, where it is judged and evaluated, and then it comes back up and is given a new body to be in. And eventually, over time, long periods of time, Greeks believed that eventually that immortal soul would ascend to a space beyond the physical plane, where it was no longer in need of a physical body to host it. And so it's kind of unrestricted at that point. This idea of dualism really gives favor to the immortal soul, and the body is really kind of seen as lesser, because eventually it decays and it dies and it goes away, and you need another one. And so there's this real dualism that goes there with the Greek way of thinking. On the other hand, though, the ancient Hebrew way of thinking gives a lot of precedent to, or a lot of favor to, the physical body. The body is critically important because it houses this breath of life. When the body dies, it goes into the ground, and the breath of life just kind of departs, goes back into the breath of life. And in that similar fashion to the Greek way of thinking, there is this underworld kind of realm called Sheol, which really truly just kind of means grave. It's not like this big plane of existence, but it is more of a grave where the dead go, and they are kind of shadows of their former embodied selves. And so that is a vastly different way of thinking from the Greek dualism, because in Greek dualism, ultimately the immortal spirit can eventually kind of ascend to this higher plane. But in this ancient Hebrew way of thinking, all of the dead, good, bad, wealthy, poor, enslaved, free, all people go into this land of Sheol, and they exist in kind of this shadowy realm there, because the ancient Hebrews believed in the cosmos as tripartite, I believe is how you say this word, where you have the heavenly realm where God and the angels exist. You have the earthly realm where humans and all living creatures exist. And then you have the realm of Sheol where all of the dead go. And so in Jewish culture and in this Jewish idea of resurrection, that's what Paul is getting to in Thessalonians, is Jesus is going to open up the gates of Sheol, and all of the dead are going to come back up and out. And we saw that kind of depicted in some of our art this morning.
And they'll be reanimated.
And they will be reanimated.
Not with the bones that have already...
Not with the bone. Yeah, so you're not coming back in the body that you had. You're going to get a new body that's going to hold the breath of life once again for you. And so you're not, that's where the conflict came with the Greek, and we're going to get into this in just a moment. All of the Greek participants in the early church kind of got hung up on that. What do you mean my old dead decaying body is going to come back to life again?
Want a new model.
A new model. I'd like to upgrade from my 2005 Honda Accord to a better Honda Accord. And so those two ideas of death really kind of lead us into two ideas of resurrection. And these both forms of resurrection we see in our scriptures, both in the Hebrew scriptures and in the New Testament scriptures. But the first idea of resurrection is really this idea of resuscitation. Can you think of any...
like Lazarus.
Like Lazarus is a perfect example. The little girl in Mark 5 is another example. We see that in 1st and 2nd Kings with Elijah and Elisha resurrecting, resuscitating sons of first of a widow and then next of a wealthy woman. And then in Acts, we see Peter and Paul both do kind of this resuscitation resurrection as well. Peter with Dorcas, and then Paul after he bores Eutychus to death, literally, because he falls out of the window and dies while Paul is preaching. Paul goes down and
he was
resuscitates.
The victim of a bad sermon.
Yes, resuscitates him, and he's back to life again. And so there's this resurrection of resuscitation, if you will. And then there's also this transformed immortal form, which is kind of the Jesus version of resurrection where he has taken on a new body. In all of the gospel stories, people don't recognize Jesus at first. He's in a new body. And then we also see that in the Hebrew scriptures in Daniel, which is very interesting. And we're not going to get all the way into Daniel today, but James Tabor goes some brilliant details about dating Daniel, how different the different time period that Daniel was written in. And this is the only space in the Hebrew Bible where we see this kind of writing about this version of resurrection. And so there's a lot of debate in the early church about Daniel's role in understanding resurrection because it was so different from the rest of the text.
So check out Daniel chapter 12.
Daniel chapter 12.
Immediately you want to go read it as soon as Tabor discusses it.
It's very, very powerful stuff. But what does all of this have to do with Paul, really? We're here to talk about Paul. And so this idea of these two kind of competing ideas of death, these two different versions of resurrection. I could just imagine, Renee, that the early church was kind of overwhelmed by all of this information and really trying to suss out, what does all of this mean for me?
Right.
Yeah.
I think there are lots of questions still. And even in Paul's community, Pharisees saw it differently Pharisees and Essenes saw it differently from Sadducees.
Yes.
So there were so many different ways of understanding it. No wonder it's confusing.
So many different ways of interpreting it, so many ways of understanding it. And ultimately, it does feel like, based on our conversation last week about Paul's role and Paul's origins, that he is kind of the perfect guy to talk about all of this stuff through both Jewish and Greek lenses.
Paul is never plagued with doubt either.
No, he's very certain all the time.
When he describes it, it has authority.
Yes, absolutely.
And the dead in Christ will rise, and I can see that in my imagination. And everybody gets a re-embodied or gets a new body and rises in the sky.
Exactly. And so we've looked at Thessalonians already, and now we're going to take a look at a couple texts from 2 Corinthians that will help us understand how Paul understands death and resurrection. Would you read 2 Corinthians 4:16 and 18?
Though our outer nature is wasting away, our inner nature is being renewed every day because we look not to the things that are seen, but to the things that are unseen. For the things that are seen are transient, the things that are unseen are eternal.
So this, for Paul, is this is a very clear kind of dualistic way of understanding.
More Greek for sure.
Far more Greek than anything else, with this kind of unseen eternal thing versus this seen physical
that's wasting away,
finite thing. Tabor writes about these verses, one would be hard-pressed to find a more succinct expression of Platonic dualism. The body is obviously the outer perishing nature, which can be seen, while the unseen inner nature, which is eternal, is the soul. Paul is making use of standard Greek language, but then he adds a most important twist, and that comes in 2 Corinthians chapter 5. Would you read that for us, Renee?
For we know that if the earthly tent we live in is destroyed, we have a building from God, a house not made with hands, eternal in the heavens. For in this tent we groan, longing to be clothed with our heavenly dwelling, if indeed, when we have taken it off, we will not be found naked. For while we are still in this tent, we groan under our burden, because we wish not to be unclothed, but to be further clothed, so that what is mortal may be swallowed up by life.
It's an interesting
That's challenging.
take. It's challenging. And he makes kind of a subtle shift away from traditional Greek dualism, this traditional way of thinking, into something a little bit more kind of Greek and Jewish blended together. Tabor writes, after evaluating 2 Corinthians chapter 5, Paul's meaning is subtle but clear. To die is to be in a naked state, unclothed without a proper dwelling, whereas to be resurrected from the dead is to be reclothed or rehoused with a new spiritual body. We can draw two very important conclusions. First, in contrast to Plato, Paul has no interest in the naked or disembodied soul. Second, the old clothing or the tent, that is, the physical body, perishes and is of no concern to him. This is Paul's view of resurrection of the dead and is consistent in all his letters. Throughout all of Paul's writing, we see this same message about resurrection. Is that the message is that the understanding that you grew up?
Yes.
You mentioned like this.
Absolutely.
Paul and his idea of resurrection is your wheelhouse.
Absolutely. And so when I would articulate to somebody when we would talk about resurrection, this understanding of not an old body that just gets reanimated, but a physical presence as well as a spiritual presence. Then I would find a lot of people that I was talking to, members of the churches that I was a part of, had a more Greek understanding of an immortal soul.
Yeah.
And I was hanging on to that because I have that image that I read to you. You know, we're rising, we're in the, it's not a bunch of souls, kind of amoebas going up into the sky.
Yeah.
It's, that physical, like Jesus giving you a hand so you can step out of the grave. Here I am. I'm back.
I'm back to do the rest of this work.
So I think I got a very consistent. I heard sermons that were absolutely about the way Paul teaches it.
Yeah. I think, you mentioned before we started recording, and I kind of want to get into that now. The way that the church, Big C Church, illustrates that and that, second coming of Jesus and people rising from the dead and being reanimated and ascending and this new heaven and new earth and all of this stuff, I think it's illustrated very differently depending on where you go to church.
Yes.
And so people either get a similar picture to you about how that whole scene is going to occur, or there is a very prominent kind of Greek dualistic way of thinking about how when our physical bodies die, our immortal soul moves on into this new kind of heavenly plane, even though that's less consistent with the Jewish traditional way of understanding resurrection. And so it almost feels like even to this day, these two ideas of resurrection are still competing with one another. And I think that's really challenging.
I told you that I went and looked at hymns because I know that some of the language that we have, a lot comes from Revelations and the end of Revelations. But I was looking to see in the Chalice hymnal for our denomination, I was going to look at the resurrection section, and I was going to bring you, and it turns out there's not a resurrection section. You have to go to the eternal life section. And I looked, and those were mostly the hymns that we would sing around Easter time. But I was thinking of hymns like Shall We Gather at the River?
Yeah.
And then I discovered that some of those hymns were in the consummation section.
Very interesting choice of words.
That that was a section that came after God's created world or creation. There was the consummation section. And of course I had to say, now, am I understanding that word properly? But I think we are shaped by the hymns that we have sung.
Absolutely.
And there is theology in all of those hymns. And sometimes it's pinned to a scripture and sometimes it's not. But I would love for people to tell us their favorite hymn about resurrection.
Absolutely. Kind of the big hymns of our tradition. Things like this, though, this line of thinking is why I don't envy Todd Brickett, because every single hymn, every single choir piece, every single bit of music that's played on the organ or on the piano or anything that is a representation of a certain theology, of a certain way of interpreting scriptural text, of a certain way of believing about who God is and what God is up to in the world. And that is it just feels so high pressure.
And think about that as well with what Orlu is helping us with art.
Absolutely.
I mean, we're seeing, we notice how many, when we were looking at resurrection, when we were in the Gospel of Mark, which were the more popular portrayals of Jesus. Everybody liked to paint Jesus with a whip when he was clearing the temple, but that was only one version of it.
Yep.
So yes, in the art, in art and music, in sermons, we have this tapestry. I like understanding more. I like this chapter because it helps me have a better idea of what the Bible says and where it's found, and a whole lot is left unsaid.
Oh my gosh. So much.
So if we know a hymn, and if we've memorized, because we sing it so much, the words of a hymn, then scripture and hymn lyrics, they're all woven in together.
Yes.
It's hard to kind of track. Well, where did I come up with that idea that we'd all sit down and have a picnic when we got to heaven? Where did that come from? Or whatever those visions are.
And this is why I was trying to look up that Robin Williams movie earlier, because even in pop culture, the way that heaven and life after death is depicted varies in which kind of route it chooses to take. And so 1998, What Dreams May Come, Robin Williams.
Yes, I remember that movie.
Beautiful movie. And it is a kind of embodiment resurrection style of interpretation, because Robin Williams' character, spoilers for a movie that was for a long time ago, 24 years ago now. Right? Did I do that math right? Yeah. 23 years ago now, because 1998, 2008, 2018, we're in 2021. So
you're quick.
Oh, math
Mind
is really
like a steel
tough.
trap.
Math is so hard. Please don't ask me to do any more math on this show.
Okay.
But he passes away and he goes to heaven, and he meets his kids again, but they have chosen different ways of representing themselves based on who they thought he really liked in life. And so he meets his son again, but his son is actually one of his best friends and coworkers. He meets his daughter again, but his daughter
very
is
confusing.
Really, and so it's almost like when Jesus reappears to the disciples and they're like, who is this? In those first moments of re-meeting his children, Robin Williams doesn't recognize them because they look different. And so even in pop culture, we see these ways that directors and writers and producers have in their own minds interpreted what it means to die and move beyond or be resurrected. So it's just fascinating.
Yes,
this chapter unlocked so many different lines of thinking for me.
Yet another reason why you might want to buy the book. This is a very interesting chapter.
I'm telling you, I mean, when you came into my office and said, where are the slides? And I'm like, I don't know yet. There's so many things.
It's big.
It is a big, hefty chapter. Speaking of big, hefty chapters, by the way, 1 Corinthians chapter 15 is often known as the resurrection chapter for Paul. And we're not going to read 1 Corinthians chapter 15. I would encourage you to open up your Bible. I'm hopeful that you have it in front of you right now. Flip to 1 Corinthians 15 and read through it. Pause this if you need to. Read that chapter of Scripture. But we see here, Paul very clearly, one of his main focuses with the church in Corinth is figuring out all this resurrection stuff. And so in 1 Corinthians 15, he's kind of in an argument with the Greek community in Corinth because about the importance of resurrection in a post-Jesus' resurrection world. Because for Paul, not only does he have a specific way of thinking about our resurrections, but he really does think that Jesus' resurrection has ushered in a new way of being resurrected. And so he's having this conversation with these culturally Greek people to convince them that the need for a body post-death is important, where in this Greek dualistic way of thinking, that's kind of absurd and unnecessary. And so what Paul does is he presents Jesus as kind of the prototype for this spirit-centric resurrection. And it's very balanced with Paul's understanding of Adam. And so if God in creating Adam gives us this kind of physical birth and this physical build way of living and way of life, then with Jesus, what God is doing is giving us this very spirit-centered way of life once our bodies have kind of gone on to the next thing. And so for Paul, Adam is representative of this physical body, where Jesus' resurrection is kind of this spiritual life, this spiritual body. And James Tabor just has a quick line about that. He says, Christ's resurrection as a life-giving spirit inaugurates the process of the new creation. I really just loved that line.
I do.
That
I
idea,
like it.
that idea that Jesus is ushering in this new way of resurrection, not only for himself, but for all of us.
This is how Paul is helping the early church understand.
Yes. And so Tabor illustrates this one more time, kind of clarifies Paul's stance by writing these words. Paul clearly believes in a bodily resurrection, or more properly, an embodied resurrection. It's one thing to say the dead will be raised bodily, and it is quite another to insist that the same bodies, long ago turned to dust and ash or buried at sea, must somehow be reconstituted in order to experience resurrection. The latter was the absurdity that the Greeks objected to in offering naive objections to the Jewish idea of the resurrection of the dead. So we see all of this work happening in 1 Corinthians 15 and 2 Corinthians chapters 4 and 5. Tabor goes on to say, resurrection is not the transformation of the physical into the spiritual, for given the corruption of the body, there is nothing left to transform. Resurrection is rather the reclothing or reincorporation of the essential self with a new immortal body that frees it from the Hadean state of death. So once we have experienced this resurrection, in this spiritual resurrection and this new embodied resurrection, we are released from that cycle of Greek thinking of our soul going into Hades, being evaluated, and then being given a new body, until eventually we're released from that way of thinking now, is Paul's argument.
Think what a huge task Paul had.
That is a massive undertaking.
He tried to reach audience with a different perspective, and how he struggled for clarity. Here's why it's important. Here's what's consistent. I mean, that was a lot of work.
Yes. I mean, his origins, his roots are in this Jewish way of understanding resurrection. And so he's doing some serious translating, not only for the people that he's talking to, but probably for himself, of really trying to find a way to not fully reject what these Greek people have understood, but to really just try and incorporate it and move beyond either version to kind of a third way.
I think I haven't appreciated fully Paul's work to make the good news accessible to a variety of people in the first century. Which I think the church is really more mindful about these days, and the people who haven't been raised in the faith, and how do we speak to multiple audiences. But that is a true missionary in the first century, to try to engage the Greek side in a resurrection conversation.
It is a task that I don't envy one single bit. And I love, though, how it's kind of come to this place in modern Christianity where the imagery and the illustrations and just all of the depictions of these different ways of going about with resurrection have all kind of come into this kind of, I don't know, it's beautiful to see all of these different ways of thinking about it. And I think it speaks to just Christianity itself, and the different ways we interpret Jesus's life and work, and the different ways we interpret how God calls us into partnership, and the different ways that people live out their faith. I just think it fits right in line in some ways with all of the different aspects of faith life that we see today.
Makes him a very contemporary thinker.
It does. I mean, I couldn't see how anyone else would have been up to that task,
right,
other than Paul. Okay. Well,
wow. Thank you, Paul.
Thank you, Paul. I can't imagine. I mean, next week is we're moving forward with Tabor.
Chapter 3.
Again. This is a huge loaf of bread, and we're trying to take not as few, but as manageable of bites as possible. I would highly encourage you to go out and find your own copy of Paul and Jesus and read along with us because there is so much in these pages that Tabor writes.
Reading the Gospels in the light of Paul is our next chapter. And I hope you feel better after.
Thank you. Drainage and allergies are getting the better of me today. I wish pollen wasn't a thing. Is there a theology of pollen? If you have any extra thoughts on our conversations about resurrection, if this has been helpful for you, if this has made things even more confusing for you, if you think of a different way of understanding resurrection that you want to share with us, you can do so.
Or your favorite hymn about resurrection.
Favorite hymn, favorite illustration, favorite words written, anything you want to share with us regarding resurrection, you can do so by sending us an email at acss@uccftw.com. This week, that email goes to both Renee and I. This is just fascinating stuff about the idea of resurrection.
Can't wait for the next conversation.
We look forward to being with you again next week. And until then, grace and peace to you.